Okay, good afternoon. This is week 4. We're moving into the modern era, and we're starting off with um, really how science and medicine affect disability. Before the theory of evolution was put out, before the 1900s, really religion and family were the two main um, controlling factors for those with disabilities. They really determined how the disabled person was treated, whether they lived or died, and where they lived, how they were cared for, and so on. Now that we're moving into the modern age, that role is being taken over at this point by science and medicine. And the medical model begins to go into effect. But let's talk about incorrect science first. And incorrect science created the theory of eugenics. And eugenics is the controlling factor in the disabled person's life in the Western culture until World War II. And society sees where eugenics leads. Eugenics is split into two types. There's positive eugenics and there's negative eugenics. The positive eugenics was this idea of building a better human race. Eugenics as a whole starts itself from a false interpretation of Darwinism and survival of the fittest and evolution. The idea that was behind this was a mixture of a misunderstanding of heredity and a misunderstanding of what evolution means. The survival of the fittest isn't a hierarchy. At this point in the early days of evolution and in the early days of eugenics, society was still caught with the great chain of being. And we're looking at Darwinism and evolution as a linear object that human race would get better. But it's not linear. In fact, we now know through evolutionary scholars like Stephen Jay Gould that evolution is much more of a web, perhaps, branching off, and that there is no top. In fact, one could argue hermit crabs and horseshoe crabs may be, in fact, the height of evolution because they've been around the longest and were able to adapt some of the best. Whereas humans are moving in that direction, but evolution doesn't really care about intelligence. It doesn't care about all of those items. What it cares about is longevity and the ability to adapt. So this idea that the troubles of humanity were an evolutionary problem was wrong. And also this idea that the races represented different species or subspecies of humanity was also wrong. We now know that that's not the case. And we know that things like poverty are not hereditary. But at this early junction, a lot of the problems of society were viewed as hereditary. And people started to move in, at first with positive eugenics, the idea of encouraging better babies, encouraging better family planning, better breeding. But that suddenly didn't become enough. And they decided they had to discourage poor family planning and poor breeding. So you started to see negative eugenics come into play. And in the early days, it started with sterilization. My friend back there, Phoenix, is a lot of where eugenics began. It began with the dog breeders and horse breeders. And dog breeders had for generations been manipulating dogs into whatever job they wanted the dog to do. And they would breed dogs to have different characteristics: long legs, short legs. Corgis were bred to herd cattle. So how do you herd cattle? Well, you bite at the cattle's hooves, but yet be short enough so that when the cattle kicks, he's going to kick above you and not hit you in the head. So corgis became the perfect cattle dog. Phoenix back there is part golden retriever, part lab. Labrador retrievers were bred to go get the dead duck the hunter just shot and bring the duck back to the hunter without eating it. Can you imagine a dog being able to give up dinner just because there's an overwhelming command to bring dinner to the owner? Well, it's something that was bred into those animals. But dogs as a whole are all the same. If you look at a newborn Chihuahua and a newborn Great Dane, you're not going to tell the difference. It's as they grow, the genetic markers pop up to make the dog tall, short, long-haired, short-haired, floppy-eared, straight-eared. All of the characteristics that humans had decided at some point were necessary for the dog's original job. Now, dogs no longer work for the most part. And Phoenix back there is a working dog. She's a service dog. So right now she's out of uniform and has the Sunday off. But typically, if you see her in public, and some of you probably have seen us on campus, you'll know that Phoenix is very serious, and she, does her routine. She'll lay under the desk for the whole class, won't move, so on. But at home, she's a crazy puppy. Being able to breed that kind of behavior into a dog makes them very useful. And the utilitarianism of dogs made dogs a very desired species for humans. So the scientists at the time and the breeders at the time began to say, we need to do the same thing with humans. We need to encourage good behavior, discourage bad behavior, and get the humans to be bred like we have had dogs done, to be more useful. So they started to look at categories, and there's where they started to make their first major mistake. What is inherited and what isn't inherited? This is the days before DNA and the genetics and understanding of either. So for the most part, scientists observed, which is what scientists usually do. But that also can get them in trouble, because observing the wrong thing can lead to false conclusions. So for example, scientists looked around and said, this couple are both poor, they get married, their children are poverty. You look back, their parents were poor. Poverty must be hereditary. Intelligence. These people dropped out of school in 3rd grade. Their children dropped out of school in 3rd grade. Their grandparents never went to school at all. Intelligence must be hereditary. These people are criminals. Their children were criminals. Their parents were criminals. Thus, the criminality must be hereditary. So suddenly you had them connecting the wrong dots. That an understanding of what causes poverty, and even to a certain extent what is poverty, began to be misrepresented. So you had some people say, this is not right. This isn't the way science works. Darwinism doesn't care if you're rich or poor. That's not the point of it. But the people who said that the poor need to be stopped from breeding and making more poor, those were the voices that were heard first. So what did that mean? Well, they began to look and see what was behavior they wanted out of the human race. And they decided that the first and easiest way to accomplish that was sterilization. So they began sterilizing prisoners. Then they began sterilizing women that were poor or uneducated. And in fact, a case went all the way to the Supreme Court in the early 1900s called Bell versus Buck. And what had happened was this young lady was sterilized against her will. And the reason was, they said that she was an imbecile, a scientific term for someone of little intelligence, but able to perform some labor. And her mother was an imbecile, and her child will be an imbecile. And therefore we need to stop more children from coming to this family line. And the Supreme Court at the time, under the great Oliver Wendell Holmes, agreed. And actually Oliver Wendell Holmes said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough for America to care for. So suddenly America became obsessed with IQ tests and intelligence tests and making sure that we weren't creating a whole generation of imbeciles. Immigrants were looked at first and tested. Now, let's think about this. You're an immigrant from Italy. The test being put in front of you is in English and references pop culture, news of the day. Now, you're coming from Italy. Very similar matter to the way those children are coming from Guatemala right now. You're escaping a place that you can't survive in. You've had no education. You certainly don't know how to speak English. You don't care nor have any desire to know what the pop culture is, who won the World Series that year, or what singer's top of the charts. So of course you fail it. And those IQ tests decided whether you were going to be allowed in the United States or not. So that was one way we started to affect intelligence. The other way, of course, was separating those that we felt were intellectually helpless, unable to function, as well as those who were physically unable. And institutional care started to come into effect, putting them in these so-called schools for their own good. You'll be seeing this week of videos from Geraldo Rivera that he had done in 1976 when he worked for ABC News in New York about a institutional care called Willowbrook. That's what eugenics led to. Willowbrook, and it also led to the Holocaust. In the case of the Holocaust, the Germans took the theory of eugenics to the umpteenth degree. Again, looking at the animal world, they said, well, what happens to dogs that are overbred and are no good? And of course, the response was euthanasia. So that started to be their response as well. But once it got to that point and Americans saw that direction, they did, for the most part, reject eugenics. Though there still was a problem of what to do with these people. Institutional care became the solution until Willowbrook. Then institutional care was rejected as well. What came next? We're still having trouble with that. America doesn't really know what to do with the disabled children and disabled adults. Community care has become increasingly used, and we'll talk about that a little bit more next week, as well as mainstreaming in the IDEA and all of those. So I said that science was involved. We talked a little bit right now about eugenics, and I have a PowerPoint up there for you to look at as well. Looked at institutional care, and you'll be able to watch Willowbrook. Some of the other issues that we see the disabled being faced with in the early 1900s was really what to do with them, what part of our society does disabled fit in, and how do we judge them. And eventually, we'll see more next week about some of the social model and the movement of the government to support and empower while leaving the disabled person in the community. Early 1900s, the key was separation and isolation, and science trying to figure out what it was doing. That's really where you're going to be at for this week. You're also going to see the rise of the means that changes everything, and that is veterans. Disabled veterans really were the ones that started all the good things that come later. Whether it's Social Security and Medicaid, whether it's things like wheelchairs and adaptive driving mechanisms for driving a car. All of those were the result of disabled vets. Even Phoenix, who just left. Service dogs were first used for disabled vets. And it is veterans care that changes everything. So we're going to look at that too next week as we move on to the social model. As far as your work this week, you're working on your second paper in which you're going to be looking at a disability. You should have your peer review done, and then you'll be putting your final draft in this week. Our last paper would deal with the modern issues for disabilities and disabled rights. All right, if you have any questions, email me. There's a couple of PowerPoints up as well on eugenics. Look at it. Look at the links that I have included. And have a good week.